Ambassador Velthrani had studied humans for 30 years. She had watched them from observation posts. She had read their history files. She had attended their diplomatic meetings and listened to their strange speeches about peace and cooperation. In all that time, she had reached one simple conclusion. Humans were soft. This was not an insult in her mind. It was simply a fact. The Korvax hegemony respected strength above all things. They had built their empire through conquest and held it through fear. Every species they encountered either submitted or was destroyed. This was the natural order of the galaxy. The strong took what they wanted. The weak gave way, but humans did not follow this order. They were strong enough to fight, yet they chose not to. They had weapons that could crack planets, yet they used them only in defense. They had fleets that could challenge any power in the known galaxy. Yet they spent most of their time delivering food and medicine to species that could offer nothing in return. Velthrani found this behavior fascinating and foolish. She had watched humans forgive enemies who had killed thousands of their people. She had seen them rebuild cities they had bombed during wars. She had observed them welcome refugees from hostile nations and give them homes and jobs and citizenship. It made no sense to her. In the Korvax way of thinking, such behavior was weakness. It invited attack. It showed that you could be hurt without consequence. The High Council of the Korvax hegemony shared her assessment. When they decided to expand into the Andara system, they knew it would mean crossing through space that humans claimed to protect. The Andara system was rich with rare minerals that the hegemony needed for their weapons programs. It was also home to a primitive species called the Velesi, who had barely discovered fire when humans first found them. 200 years ago, the humans had taken the Velesi under their protection. They had built orbital stations around the Velesi homeworld. They had cured diseases that had plagued the Velesi for generations. They had watched over them like parents watching over children, never interfering with their development, but always standing guard against outside threats. The High Council saw this as further proof of human weakness. The Velesi had nothing to offer. They could not fight. They could not trade. They could not even understand that other species existed beyond their sky. Yet humans spent enormous resources protecting them. It was charity of the most foolish kind. Velthrani was chosen to lead the diplomatic mission that would precede the Korvax fleet. Her task was simple. She would explain to the humans that the hegemony intended to pass through their protected space and take control of the Andara system. She would offer them a chance to withdraw peacefully. She expected them to protest and negotiate, and perhaps even cry, as she had seen humans do when faced with difficult situations. But she did not expect them to fight. Not really. She had prepared her arguments carefully. She would remind the humans of all the times they had chosen peace over war. She would point out that the Velesi were not human citizens and that humans had no legal obligation to protect them. She would suggest that the hegemony might allow some Velesi to survive as a labor force, which was more than most conquered species received. She would be reasonable and patient, as one must be when dealing with emotional species. Her ship arrived at the border of human-protected space on a cold morning by Earth's calendar. The human fleet was already waiting. Velthrani counted 47 vessels of various sizes, from small patrol craft to massive carriers that dwarfed her own diplomatic ship. It was an impressive display, but she was not worried. Humans always made impressive displays. It was part of their need to appear strong while being soft inside. She transmitted her credentials and requested a meeting with whoever commanded this fleet. The response came within minutes. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin would speak with her directly. Velthrani was pleased. A direct conversation would make things easier. She could read human expressions and adjust her approach as needed. The Admiral's face appeared on her screen. Chen Weilin was a small human female with gray hair and lines around her eyes. She looked tired, Velfrani thought. Tired and old. This would be easy. Velfrani began her prepared speech. She spoke of the hegemony's need for resources. She spoke of the inevitability of expansion. She spoke of the reasonable terms the Corvex were willing to offer in exchange for peaceful passage. She spoke for nearly 20 minutes, and throughout it all, Admiral Chun simply watched her with those tired eyes. When Velfrani finished, she waited for the negotiations to begin. She expected counteroffers. She expected pleas for more time. She expected the emotional appeals that humans were so famous for. Instead, Admiral Chun was quiet for a long moment. Then she began to speak, and her voice was soft. She talked about the Valesi. She described how the young ones painted pictures of the sunrise every morning as a form of prayer. She mentioned the elders who had wept with joy when human doctors arrived to cure the plague that had killed so many of their people. She spoke of the trust the Valesi had placed in humanity, a trust so complete that they had built temples to honor their protectors from the sky. Velfrani listened politely. This was exactly what she had expected. Emotional appeals. Soft words. The prelude to surrender. But then something changed in the Admiral's voice. It grew quieter, not louder. Colder, not warmer. And Velfrani felt something she had not felt in many years. She felt uncertain. Admiral Chen Weilin looked at the alien ambassador through her screen and felt a familiar weight settle into her chest. She had hoped this day would never come. She had spent her entire career hoping that the galaxy would leave humanity's protected species alone. But hope, she knew, was not a strategy. The Corvex ambassador had just finished speaking. Velfrani was her name, and she had been talking for 20 minutes about resources and expansion and reasonable terms. She spoke as if the Valesi were objects to be negotiated over. She spoke as if humanity's love for its adopted children was a weakness to be exploited. Chun had heard speeches like this before. Every few decades, some species decided to test human resolve. They saw humanity's kindness and mistook it for something else. They watched humans forgive and rebuild and welcome strangers, and they drew the wrong conclusions. So Chun began to speak. She kept her voice soft at first. She talked about the Valesi children and their sunrise paintings. She described the way the elders cried when the plague was cured. She spoke of trust and protection and the sacred duty humanity had accepted 2 centuries ago. She watched the ambassador's face as she spoke. Velfrani looked bored, patient, confident. She thought she knew how this conversation would end. She thought humans would protest and negotiate and eventually give way, as soft species always did. Chun let her voice grow quieter. This was the part that never got easier. She explained that humanity's love was not unconditional. This surprised the ambassador. Chun could see it in the slight shift of her posture, the flicker of confusion in her eyes. The galaxy had misunderstood humans for centuries. They saw forgiveness and assumed it meant humans would forgive anything. They saw mercy and assumed it meant humans were incapable of cruelty. They were wrong. Humans loved fiercely and completely, Chun explained. They loved the helpless and the innocent and the trusting. They loved those who could not protect themselves. And this love came with a condition that the galaxy had failed to understand. Anyone who threatened those under human protection would discover what humans did to those they did not love. The ambassador laughed. It was a small laugh, controlled and dismissive. She said she had watched humans forgive genocides. She said she had seen humans rebuild the cities of their enemies. Surely this was just more emotional posturing. Chun did not argue. Instead, she transmitted a set of coordinates. A star system called Carthage 7. She invited the Corvex to scan what remained there before making any final decisions. The ambassador frowned. She said she had never heard of Carthage 7. It was not in any database she could access. That, Chun said quietly, was the point. The transmission ended. Chun sat alone on her bridge and stared at the stars beyond her window. Her hands were steady, but inside she felt the old sickness rising. She hated this part of her job. She hated what humanity was capable of. She hated that their greatest strength and their greatest horror were the same thing. 47 ships waited under her command. Every crew member knew what might be coming. They had all studied the classified histories. They had all seen the recordings from Carthage 7. None of them wanted to repeat what had been done there, but all of them would, if they had to. That was what it meant to serve in the protection fleet. 3 days passed. The Corvex fleet held position at the border. Chun received reports that Velfrani had dispatched scanning teams to the coordinates she provided. She waited and remembered. 200 years ago, humanity had been young in the galactic community. They had been eager to explore and make friends and prove themselves worthy of respect. They had sent colony ships full of families to settle new worlds. They had believed that the galaxy would welcome them. A species called the Vorn had taught them otherwise. The Vorn were raiders. They attacked human colony ships for sport. They killed some passengers and took others as slaves. And they made the mistake that would define humanity's reputation for centuries to come. They transmitted recordings of their atrocities back to Earth. They wanted to frighten humans into submission. They wanted to show that resistance was futile. They did not understand what they had done. Chun had watched those recordings. As part of her training, every officer in the protection fleet was required to watch them. Not because the brass wanted to inspire hatred, but because they wanted every officer to understand why humanity could never allow such things to happen again. The recordings showed children crying for parents who would never come. They showed horrors that Chun would not describe even in her private thoughts, and they showed what happened to the Vorn. Afterward, the Vorn had expected negotiations. They had expected ransom demands and diplomatic protests. What they received was 11 years of silence. During those 11 years, humanity had changed. They had built weapons that should not have existed. They had developed technologies driven by a grief so profound that it had become engineering. And when they finally emerged from their silence, they had not come to negotiate. The Vorn homeworld was now an asteroid field. Their colonies were glass. Their species existed only in human museums, preserved as a warning to any who might consider following their path. Chun had never visited those museums. She did not need to. The weight of what humanity had done lived in her bones, passed down through generations of soldiers who understood that their capacity for love and their capacity for destruction were mirror images of each other. Now the Corvex were approaching. Carthage 7. Soon they would see for themselves what remained of the Vorn's empire. And then they would make their choice. Chun hoped they would choose wisely. The Corvex. Scanning teams arrived at Carthage 7 expecting to find a ruined world. What they found was worse. There was no world at all. The entire system had been reduced to debris. Where planets should have orbited a yellow star, there was only dust and rock and the faint radioactive signature of weapons that defied. Understanding. Commander Threk led the scanning team. He was a veteran of 12 campaigns, a soldier who had seen worlds burn and species broken. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for Carthage-7. The system should not have existed. It was not in any database. No records mentioned it. No map showed its location. The coordinates provided by the human admiral led to a place that had been erased from galactic history. Yet here it was, a graveyard floating in the void. Threk ordered his team to begin detailed scans. They found the remnants of what had once been a thriving civilization. The Vorn had built great cities on their homeworld. They had constructed orbital stations and mining platforms throughout their system. They had been a spacefaring species with a population of 9 billion. Now there was nothing but ash and echoes. The scanning teams worked for 6 days. They cataloged debris patterns and radiation signatures. They calculated the force required to shatter a planet into fragments small enough to drift away on solar winds. The numbers they produced made no sense. No known weapon could cause this level of destruction. The Korvax had thought their own arsenal was the most powerful in the galaxy. They had been wrong. On the 7th day, they found the recordings. The humans had left them in a small probe orbiting the outer edge of the debris field. The probe was designed to be found by anyone who came looking. It contained video files and audio, messages, and written accounts of what had happened to the Vorn. Threk watched them alone in his quarters. And when he was finished, he sat in darkness for a long time. The recordings showed human soldiers at work. They moved with terrible efficiency, clearing Vorn colonies one by one. There was no rage in their faces. No joy. No hatred. They looked tired and sad and completely determined. They killed with the mechanical precision of people doing a job they despised but would not abandon. One recording stood out. It showed a human female in a military uniform standing before a camera. Her name was given as Lieutenant Sarah Chun, and Threk noticed that she shared a family name with the admiral who now guarded the Valesi. The woman was crying as she spoke, tears running down her face even as her voice remained steady. She explained what humanity had become. She talked about the colony ships and the children who had died screaming for help that never came. She described the 11 years of silence during which humanity had built their terrible weapons. And she spoke of the horror that lived in every human heart. The knowledge of what they were capable of when love turned to its opposite. The Vorn, she said, had awakened something in humanity that humans had spent their entire history trying to contain. Humans knew what lived inside them. They had seen it in their wars and their atrocities and their capacity for cruelty. They had built civilizations and laws and religions specifically to cage the beast that dwelt in their souls. The Vorn had broken that cage. They had taken human children and tortured them for entertainment. They had believed that humans would respond with fear and submission. They had not understood that human love and human wrath were the same fire, burning in different directions. Lieutenant Chen's recording ended with a message for anyone who might find it. She hoped, she said, that this would be the last time. She hoped that the galaxy would learn from the Vorn's mistake and leave humanity's protected peoples alone. She hoped that humans would never again have to become what they had become at Carthage-7. But if anyone threatened human-protected species again, she warned, they would find that humans had not forgotten how to be monsters. They had simply chosen not to be. And choice, unlike instinct, could be changed. Commander Threk transmitted his findings to Ambassador Velthrani. He included the recordings and the scan data and his own assessment of what it all meant. His assessment was simple. The Korvax should withdraw immediately. The humans were not bluffing. They were not posturing. They were something far more dangerous than the hegemony had ever imagined. Velthrani watched the recordings in her private quarters. She had been so certain that she understood humans. She had spent 30 years studying them, watching them forgive and reconcile and choose peace over war. She had seen their softness and assumed it was weakness. Now she understood the truth. Humans were not soft because they were weak. They were soft because they were terrified of their own strength. Their kindness was not the absence of cruelty, but the constant, deliberate rejection of it. Every act of mercy was a choice made by a species that knew exactly how merciless it could be. The Vorn had believed that transmitting recordings of human suffering would break human will. Instead, it had done something far worse. It had given humanity permission to stop being kind. It had released them from the cage they had built around their own hearts. and humanity had responded by erasing the Vorn from existence. Velthrani thought about the Valesi, painting their sunrises in innocent prayer. She thought about the human ships orbiting their world, watching over them like guardians from a nightmare dressed in gentle clothes. She thought about what would happen if Korvax's weapons fell on those primitive people, and she felt something she had not felt since she was a young diplomat fresh from the academy. She felt afraid. The Korvax fleet withdrew on the 9th day. Ambassador Velthrani transmitted a single message to Admiral Chun before departing. She apologized for the misunderstanding. She expressed hope for future peaceful relations. She did not mention the Endara system or the Valesi, or the term she had offered just 9 days before. Admiral Chun accepted the apology with grace. She wished the ambassador safe travels and expressed her own hope for peace. Neither of them mentioned Carthage 7. Neither of them needed to. The human fleet remained at the border for another 3 weeks, watching to make sure the Korvax truly left. During those long days of waiting, Chun thought about what had almost happened. She thought about the Valesi children who would never know how close they had come to destruction. She thought about the orders she had been prepared to give if the Korvax had crossed the line. She was grateful that she had not needed to give them when the last Korvax ship disappeared from sensors. Chun ordered her fleet to stand down. The crisis was over. The Valesi were safe. Humanity had shown its teeth without having to bite. This was the best possible outcome, the one every officer in the protection fleet trained for and hoped for. Chun retired to her quarters and poured herself a glass of water with hands that trembled only slightly. She thought about Lieutenant Sarah Chun, her great-grandmother, crying in that recording 200 years ago. The weight of what humanity carried had been passed down through her family like a genetic burden. Every Chun who served in the fleet knew the truth about their species. Every one of them hoped they would never have to prove it again. Ambassador Velthrani returned to the Korvax homeworld a changed person. She had been so confident in her understanding of humans. She had written papers about their psychology. She had advised the High Council based on decades of observation. All of it had been wrong. She requested a meeting with the council immediately upon her return. When she stood before them, she did not speak of military assessments or tactical calculations. Instead, she spoke of what she had learned about human nature. Other species in the galaxy had limits built into their biology. Aggression faded when threats were removed. Rage cooled when enemies surrendered. Survival instincts demanded compromise and adaptation. These limits made war predictable. They made peace possible. They allowed species to fight, and then stop fighting when the cost became too high. Humans had no such limits. Their psychology did not include automatic shutoffs for violence. Their rage did not fade with time or distance. When humans decided that something was worth protecting, they committed to that protection without biological constraints. They would burn worlds and break species, and salt the earth of entire civilizations, if that was what their love required. The council listened in uncomfortable silence. Some of them wanted to argue. Some of them wanted to insist that the hegemony was stronger than any human fleet. But the recordings from Carthage 7 played on screens around the chamber, and the arguments died in their throats. Velthrani explained the most terrifying thing she had learned. Human forgiveness was not weakness. It was the strongest thing about them. Humans forgave because they knew what they would become if they did not. Every act of mercy was a conscious choice to remain civilized. Every peace treaty was a decision to keep the monster caged. When the Vorn had tortured human children, they had not broken human will. They had freed humans from the obligation to be kind. They had given humanity permission to become what they feared most about themselves. And humanity had accepted that permission with terrible completeness. The Council voted unanimously to abandon all plans for the Endara system. They voted to establish a permanent policy regarding human protected species. That policy was simple. Any species under human protection was to be treated as if it were human itself. No exceptions. No negotiations. No testing of boundaries. Velthrani spent the remaining years of her career teaching this lesson to anyone who would listen. She traveled to academies and diplomatic schools throughout the hegemony. She showed the recordings from Carthage 7. She explained human psychology in terms that Corvax could understand. Humans. She told her students were not dangerous because of their technology or their numbers or their strategic brilliance. They were dangerous because of what lived inside them. Every human carried the capacity for both great love and great destruction, and these capacities were the same force pointed in different directions. When humans loved, they loved completely. They adopted strange species on distant worlds and called them children. They spent resources and time and lives protecting people who could never repay them. They built temples of kindness and walked paths of mercy, and they did all of this by choice. But when that love was betrayed, it did not disappear. It transformed. Every ounce of tenderness became targeting data. Every act of nurturing became a template for systematic annihilation. The same force that drove humans to save strangers drove them to destroy anyone who threatened what they loved. And unlike other species, humans had no biological failsafe. No instinct would make them stop. No survival mechanism would demand compromise. Once the line was crossed, humans would continue until the threat was eliminated. No matter the cost, no matter the time, no matter how much they hated what they were doing. This, Velthrani concluded, was why the galaxy had misunderstood humanity for so long. They saw human kindness and assumed it was natural. They saw human mercy and thought it was instinctive. They did not realize that every gentle act was a battle won against the darkness inside. Humans were not soft. They were the most dangerous species in the galaxy, precisely because they worked so hard to be kind. Far away, on a small blue-green world in the Andar system, the Valesi continued their daily rituals. The children painted pictures of the sunrise each morning, as they had done for generations. The elders told stories of the sky guardians who had cured the Great Plague. The priests maintained the temples where the people gave thanks for their protectors from beyond the stars. None of them knew what had almost happened. None of them understood the terrible power that watched over them. They lived in peace and innocence, painting their sunrises and singing their songs, protected by a species they would never fully comprehend. And in the cold spaces between stars, human ships kept their eternal vigil. Their crews hoped they would never need to become what they had been at Carthage 7. They trained for the worst and prayed for the best. They carried the weight of their species' terrible potential and chose, every day, to be something better. Because that was what it meant to be human. Not soft, not weak. Simply choosing, moment by moment, to love rather than destroy, and hoping that choice would always be enough.